Hey, good morning to everybody. Thanks for joining this morning. So today we are having a bit of a international edition for a CAASA training session, and I'm very pleased to welcome some colleagues and friends from around the world to share with you today some insights on how adjudication is playing out in their regions. And also some wider topics around what's happening in the construction world at the moment. So you will have seen from the invite that we have three main themes today. Number one is looking at the practical application of adjudication, particularly in the UK and in Turkey and neighbouring countries in Eurasia. And then secondly, looking at how some of the other countries around the world have fared in their exit from COVID and the impacts of COVID, and some lessons learned around that in terms of claims and disputes. And then thirdly, we're going to look at what are the current impacts as a result of the tension and the war in Ukraine, in terms of particularly price escalation globally, and the major constraints that the war is putting on supply chains. And to help us go through that discussion and those themes, I'm welcoming Rob Driscoll, who is in London, and Rob is the Director of Legal and Business at the ECA. And then secondly, John Lancaster, who's in Singapore, and he's a Senior Managing Director at GS Held. And then thirdly, John Arat, who's in Istanbul, and he's a partner, founder and partner of a boutique construction law firm, one of not many in Turkey, called Tuga Arat. So a real international flavour to today's session. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting. I do invite questions at any time in the chat box, and to the extent that we can, we will try to take those questions in real time. It doesn't always work out that way. So if we don't get to the question in real time, we'll get to it at the end. The format for today is that each panelist will have a little bit of time to do some formal presentation on some or all of the three themes, followed by some discussion and opportunity for questions. And once all three panelists have had an opportunity to present, there'll be open floor at the end of the session for anybody to jump in and raise questions or observations or comments. So that's the plan of action. I do hope you enjoy it. And yeah, let's start with Rob in London. Rob, the floor is yours. Okay. Yeah, so we want Rob rather than John. There we go.
You want slides rather than me, trust me.
So yeah, Rob, please.
I'll introduce myself whilst
yeah.
Tiffany, hopefully you can get the slides to share on the screen. That's it. So my name is Rob Driscoll. I'm a solicitor by trade. If you want to put that on slideshow, it will come bigger. That's it. Move to the second screen. Second slide, please. You'll get a bit of an introduction. So my day job is Director of Legal and Business at a trade body, the trade body that looks after the electrotechnical sector in the UK, which means we have 2,700 contractors as members. When you get towards the medium-sized above enterprise, that they tend to deliver MEP or M&E, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, or mechanical, electrical. There's a few badges I've kind of collected along the way. One is that I am an advisor to the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office is the part of UK central government that looks after UK procurement. On average, UK government spends £295 billion. Footnote, I mention a lot of figures as I go through, because we fundamentally believe you can't make decisions unless you have information. Otherwise, you're making decisions in the dark. So we work with the government, both as a regulator and as a client, to make a better industry. And improve the way the economy works in that sense. So my role is lawyer, part-time amateur economist, part-time political analyst. We deal with a help desk where we deal with these 2,700 contractors in the mechanical electrical space. I've done that for 20 years. I used to be in private practice. But aside from that, we take the data we collect about trends in the industry to inform strategic decisions, which includes dispute resolution. So I will go back to adjudication, if I may, at the end of this, because I think this is about the context of when adjudication does and doesn't work. But for you guys in different economies around the world, you've first got to understand the shape of ours, because you might, and you are entitled to think that's not going to work here. There's some Boy Scout badges at the bottom, which means apparently I'm had a decent career, but the CLC is probably worth explaining because that's the conduit that sits between industry and government. Starts off as a bit of a speed dial list for a minister, ends up as the, if you like, the strategic leaders of the industry sitting around the table with government as both a regulator and as a client, so top civil servants, talking about digital twins, BIM, how you solve a skills shortage, all sorts of industry-facing issues. And that's because in the UK, government accounts for 35% of demand. It's highly fragmented as a client, so it doesn't act as one homogenous mass. You have central government departments like Defence, Ministry of Justice, others. Then you have regional governments and mayoral authorities and others, which may be a different colour political party and inclined to do something slightly at odds with the central. So it's a bit of a wilderness when you get to that area. These opinions are my own, by the way, not necessarily ECA's. But that's why there's an importance, because if you've got 35% of your demand sat with the public sector, it's in their interest, both as a regulator and as a client, to have an industry which is fit for purpose and has the right levels of competence, capability and capacity to deliver for you. If you want to move on a slide, I will talk about the economy. So in the UK, we've had relative stability for the last 50 years compared to where we are now. Now, most economies will claim that at the moment. To give you a bit of context, if I walk into a room, as I've been doing some roadshows over the last 3 months, I tended to start off by saying, well, put your hand up if you're below 50 years old. Nobody below that threshold will have remembered, they may be alive, but they won't remember the true cost of cash. Because it's only when the cash runs out that the commercial behaviour starts to harden in the economy. But to give you an idea of how we have fared, the bottom right is our economic performance in construction. So the sharp V-shaped crash at the bottom right is what happened in COVID. We were an industry, as a country, we went into lockdown in March 2020. Proud to say that we were already doing COVID advice legally in February, when our then Prime Minister was still making jokes about it's not really a serious thing, is it? We were starting to see some supply chain disruption. So we were looking at an industry which is broadly fixed lump sum pricing, doesn't engage in fluctuation provisions where you can fluctuate price according to the market. And everything is therefore fairly static. Changes in prices and costs are with the supplier, not the buyer. Thankfully, that same Prime Minister said, carry on. Other parts of the UK didn't necessarily have that privilege. So in Scotland, the First Minister at the time said, no, human life is more important. We will stop construction in other areas too. That tanked the economy and crashed it to an extent because productivity stopped. The V-shaped crash is there because obviously part of that is consumer construction. And that just doesn't fare so well because of the worry that was in society at the time where people didn't want trades coming into their homes and other things. But nevertheless, on the top left, you have the shape of what happened to materials, demand, output, and costs against each other. So what you're seeing as a broader message is we hit 2020, things are going okay. We've kind of stagnated, but not too badly. So there's some real growth in there since 2016 in the UK, where we had Brexit, which caused a great amount of uncertainty in the financial markets. And then we hit this crash. And there's two issues that hit the crash. The crash stops commercial projects briefly. It stops consumers for a little bit longer. But consumers have this working from home issue. They're starting to stockpile cash because they don't have many expenses. And then it bounces straight back above pre-pandemic levels in terms of demand, because things unlock and come back online again. People would think, what am I going to do with this cash? If we move to the next slide, please. So you have two sets of pressures, supply side and demand side. And I'll just run down some of those in terms of the EU trade deficit. So we're moving to a post-Brexit environment. That's 2016 sounds a long time ago. That was the referendum, but actually we're still dealing with how you unlock a 40-year marriage and what the barriers look like when I think it's roughly 60% of our products come via the EU. Materials might come from elsewhere, but the products, the manufactured finished goods for construction, come from the EU themselves. We supply the EU with a lot as well. UK CA marking, that was another byproduct of Brexit, where suddenly everything has to be remarked to be a fit for purpose product in the UK. We found that because of displacement of supply chains around the world in terms of shipping, we had freight problems. The cost of freight rose by 88%, driving the cost of materials. Fuel rises, again, it's been around the world, but it hasn't gone down. It's gone up. It's stayed static since. We had a shortage of HGV drivers post-Brexit. They had to requalify. It was, thankfully, when things hit the mainstream press here, so the grocery stores started lobbying government, they do something about it. We then hit Russia, Ukraine, and we start to see slowdown in appetite for raw materials from China because it locks and unlocks. But even Russia, Ukraine, at first, the view here was that won't affect much of us. We only get 6% of our materials from that area. It wasn't the materials as finished products. It was the raw materials that hurt us. We got softwood, timber, bitumen, pig automate UK steel, palladium, which makes semiconductors, which means we still have a problem with automotive industry, lights. Every gadget in the construction industry more or less has a semiconductor chip in it. And then we have China locking and unlocking before it did a U-turn on its policy. That's driving supply side inflation. Demand is what I was referring to earlier. So we still have demand exceeding pre-pandemic levels as we run out. We were starting to see domestic consumers even off because they shifted from house renovations, extensions, loft conversions, and other things through to holidays because we unlocked. The infrastructure revolution, we have various railway tunnels and other projects. But what we did, which we saw demand for a supply that wasn't there and supply ramping up with more cost than it could cope with. Now, the interesting thing, if we move to the next slide, time lags. Any good economist knows that where the press will focus on housing, residential usually, and mainstream baskets of goods for inflation, they'll talk about what inflation is in the UK economy. It doesn't necessarily reflect construction because construction projects take time to procure, they take time to deliver. So the average delivery period here is 12 to 18 months, so project duration. If you're entering a fixed price contract at the start, you've got to bet as a supplier that you can hold those costs through the life of the project. That's why we hit problems economically in terms of inflation. So we unlocked that demand that was pent up in 2020 from COVID. We hit 21. It unlocks from one side and the other. We also hit Russia, Ukraine, which drives up inflation from a different perspective. And we have double inflation. Mainstream UK inflation is around 10%, 9%, if you want to believe the bit on the left. Electrical inflation, 25+% because of the semiconductor issue. Semiconductors also sit in boilers, so we were driving up mechanical as well. I mentioned we're mechanical electrical. Your tendency might be to turn around and go, well, that's not us. He's just talking about his trade. We, on average, account for 40% of the cost of construction on any project. These are just averages, sweeping statements. But then it's interesting to see that we are one of the most significant chunks in packages that on average number 70 different types of trades on any one job. But it makes for a significant part of cost that cannot be controlled. And cost which has a high rate of failure, if you think about in oversimplistic terms, construction being a process, this as a subset represents the technology that runs the built asset and will run it through the life cycle. So really you've just got an illustration of what happened with wage inflation and materials inflation. We're probably now at a place where interest rates have risen and risen and risen. I asked the audience question, who's below 50, who doesn't know the true cost of cash? Because post-financial crisis, we had something called quantitative easing, which artificially suppressed the rate of borrowing to nearly nothing. Now, what that's done at the moment is we've gone back up to 5.56% in inflation terms, push pressures on mortgages, then on consumers. The highest area of construction, aside from public infrastructure jobs, would be private housing. So you're starting to see the Bank of England damp down the demand side inflation, squeeze the economy a bit, but it does mean people are then looking for higher wages to pay for their increased cost of living. Why is it only bouncing back to a 60-year view of what normal looks like? Because in 1985, the interest rate in the UK was 15.5%. So actually 5 to 6% isn't a huge problem. But there's a whole generation there that has known the cost of borrowing as being pretty much nothing. So if you want it, get it, it doesn't matter. If we can move to the next slide. This gives you that breakdown of how each different sector is compared. I guess the problem with relying on public infrastructure, which is a chunk of the public demand, that 35% demand, is it's not an even keel. There are major projects like nuclear or rail, which suck labour out of particular territories. And once they're done, they're done. If we move to the next slide, because you're probably all wondering, well, what relevance has this got to do with dispute resolution, payment, or anything else? You're here to think about adjudication. Well, the picture I'm painting is we've come out of an economy that is extremely turbulent. We still have a shadow that we're talking about, which is what if, and it's only if, but it's a real risk that COVID contractually was unforeseeable. Most of us lawyers will remember having a closer look at force majeure for the first time in our lives, really, and giving it the scrutiny it deserved. COVID was an unforeseeable risk, though you then had Russia, Ukraine, which we all thought would never happen, collectively. when it comes to China, Taiwan, that is now seen as a risk in the UK that you could predict. So if it happens, people should be ready and have mitigated that. So boardrooms are now getting ready for that risk. Doesn't mean they're doing anything, they're just factoring it into their calculations of risk. So the whole economic picture that I'm really trying to paint, it tells us how much money is sloshing around the economy. I said you've got 405,000 businesses in the UK economy. 400,000 of the 405,000 are SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. There's a lot of self-employed micros, which is either single-person businesses or 0 to 5. Supply chains are 4 to 5 levels deep, which means the client at the top is vastly divorced from the deliverer at the bottom, and you have high levels of fragmentation and disaggregation as you go down the pyramid. What does that mean? Well, having come from a construction family, it does mean that over time, you can actually make more money on being an intermediary, i.e. bankrolling the money, than you can on building anything. So again, going back to the 1985 culture, you could trade on money overnight, making 15.5% interest rate, which gave you a higher revenue stream than anything to do with actual construction, which breeds a culture of holding on to money. The average profit margin in the industry is 2.5%. That's extremely low and extremely thin. If you think about what a dispute that doesn't go away sucks in terms of costs out of the system. So here's a bit of a picture of the various initiatives we've got of trying to solve payment problems, because payments breed disputes, right? Just to give you a quick rundown, public contracts regs, well, so as of next year, it will be implied term into every public sector contract at tier 1, 2, and 3. The payments must be made within 30 days. That will be carte blanche. They've increased the rigor of that over the last couple of years post-Brexit. We have something in Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And England, the policy is do it unless there's a good reason why not. Does mean you can always think of a good reason why not. Project bank accounts. You put the money into an account outside the contractual chain, safeguards it from insolvency within the supply chain, simultaneously releases it to parties within the supply chain, but doesn't give you transparency. We have a prompt payment code right across all of commerce, which includes construction. If you want to win public sector work, 35% of demand in the industry, you've got to really be a code signatory to get there. That includes the charter, but so really it's a badge of honor. And to win a public sector contract over 5 million, you must prove that 95% of your invoices are paid within 60 days, or else you will not qualify. Late payment legislation, you've got 8% above base interest on late payment as a mandatory contractual term. You can alter the rate, and it is altered often down to 5%, sometimes even 2%, but you can't get rid of the rate. You must have some other substantial remedy. Supply chain finance came in and kind of died off because of our household name going bust, called Carillion. But that was where the large payer tells its bank to pay you early as the payee and doesn't have to pay until the original payment date. So they could stick with 60 days, but their bank pays you on 30 days. And it was a method of introducing liquidity into the supply chain. Retentions reform, well, we're still battling that one. And that's about safeguarding the cash from insolvency of either party before it's released, because it's very much abused. Small Business Commissioner doesn't include construction in this country, which is very odd, given that I said 400,000 businesses are small, medium-sized enterprises. And the other ones I'll just cover briefly are, there is a duty on large firms, which is anything with £36 million turnover upwards and 250 employees plus, to report their payment behaviour. So how many payments they pay within 0 to 30 days, 30 to 60 days, 60 days plus, and various other metrics, to a government website, and it's open source data. In other words, anybody can access it. And then lastly, down the bottom, Construction Act. which is the short slang name for our Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act that was amended in 2010 by another one. Came in, yep.
Just a quick question that's come through from the audience in relation to the reference you made to the implied 30-day payment term in all tier 1, 2, and 3 public sector contracts. The question is, do you know what is the sanction if payment is not in fact made within that 30 days?
Breach of contract. So there was the sanction on the public sector body itself, or the party not putting it in the contract. It was in EU law. It's part of the divorce process. It was part of EU law, but it was an implied term into the contract. So the law was pretty weak. Now it will be an implied term, so that even if it doesn't appear in your physical contract, you could go to it and say, you're supposed to pay me in 30 days. You haven't, breach of contract.
Yeah.
And enforce it like that. So I guess the picture I'm painting is the UK hasn't seen payment as a one-size problem where there's a silver bullet to fix all of it. It's about payment behaviour. Some of these initiatives try and fix the issue at source and improve it. Some of them try and fix the symptoms. So allow the party owed money better leverage to get money back. Adjudication is one of those. We're basically in the dispute resolution spectrum of the law. We had litigation and arbitration. Arbitration is great, but here it's began to mirror litigation. So I was taught, and when I qualified in 2001, the process is broadly identical to litigation. So you'll involve solicitors, you'll involve barristers, you will get into technical experts. The award might not be published, which are two of the benefits of it, but it could go on for years. So in that sense, does it become accessible for a tier 1 or tier 2 main contractor or subcontractor who's looking to recover monies? Does it help the client who's looking to deliver a project when the parties have all walked off site midway through the job? So we very much look at it as, how do you actually deliver the project, rather than how do you, this might be the slightly controversial bit, create an industry for lawyers to make more money. So adjudication came along in 96 in the Construction Act, implemented in 98, amended in 2010 as a quicker mini arbitration. It runs to two key features. It can be, key features are, it's statutory, it's mandatory in all construction contracts unless the contract is with a residential owner occupier, to carve out consumer contracts on their own dwellings. That's nearly all of construction. It has to have adjudication in it, and the Act also regulated payment dates, when you get paid, not what you get paid. It allowed the parties to quickly go off under a 28-day process, trying to articulate what your dispute was, throw it at an expert with construction expertise who would make a decision, which is binding in interim nature until finally concluded in either arbitration, agreement, or court. 99% elements as taken as final and not overturned. But since 98, we have hijacked it as a legal profession. People do now routinely employ solicitors and barristers to do it for them. There are some tricks to the litigious process of adjudication, which can undermine it. So people have stopped doing their own adjudications as engineers and surveyors. It's started to be a legal process. You routinely find there are natural justice challenges, jurisdictional challenges. You're answering the wrong question, Mr. or Mrs. Adjudicator. And what happens in terms of those payment problems that it's trying to fix is there's a large chunk of them which are now not viable, because any of us around the table will tell you, if you move to the next slide, please, you're trying to get money back. and you're owed money. So do you really want to destroy the relationship? That's just a different way of looking at the same jigsaw. Some of it is law, some of it is policy. But I thought I'd show you it. So lastly and finally, before Steph says you've had your time and more, Rob, get off, is two things. We have now got something called the Conflict Avoidance Pledge, which people are signing up to. So it's a statement of what good looks like in terms of dispute resolution management in projects. You have gold, silver, bronze members. Bronze could be flag bearers like us as a body who don't do construction, but we are, if you like, political and market bodies that set standards. And then gold will be repeat big brand clients and contractors who will actually be doing it. And to get gold, they have to prove, things like Transport for London, that they have these systems in operation within their contracts. Could be dispute resolution boards or things like that. And then the second one is low value adjudication. So you can write this into your contract, so it's not statutory, but to tackle the fact that the profession has increased the costs and therefore there's a ton of this that aren't viable, they've created a low value system. If you write it into the contract, you can send your dispute to it. Depending on the size of the dispute claim, will dictate what the adjudicator's fees are and how much can be charged. Because the problem in this economy where costs, inflation are rampant, it's highly volatile, you've got half the market trying to continue with fixed lump sum prices, the other half of the market on the supply side trying to deliver contracts which move with the market using either fluctuations or contingency sums or various bits and pieces like that, or indexation in the facilities and maintenance sector, is commercial behaviour hardens because people have to survive. They survive by not paying other people. That breeds disputes. We do monitor the level of disputes because one of the adjudicator nominating bodies that has about 80 to 90% market share is RICS, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and they can keep an eye on the levels of nominating adjudicators throughout the pandemic, and that helped us. So really where we are is we introduced adjudication, and in many ways the UK gave birth to it. It's worked because it is statutory and anybody can access it at any time during the job. We made some mistakes, in my personal opinion. Having 2 notices was one of them, and other jurisdictions have repaired that. Ireland, particularly when they brought theirs in, have 1 notice in the middle. New Zealand is a bit more proactive, and they've actually gone to try and protect through legislation, retentions and other things. But I'll stop there and let Steph tell us whether she wants to take it into questions or straight into the next person. Or
Yeah, Rob, brilliant. Thanks so much. It was really fascinating, and it was actually fantastic to start this this conversation today with some hard statistics from the UK. And I mean, some of those percentages are pretty eye-watering, aren't they? You know, freight costs going up by as much as 88%. And with that, I wonder, you know, did the fallout from COVID, particularly for the smaller contractors, and all of this price squeeze and difficulty in delivering projects because of, you know, the price, the unavailability of goods, the challenges of transport, etc. Did that lead to more disputes on your projects in the UK? And did that mean that there was more use of adjudication as a result?
It did. So what happened was we actually lobbied the number 10 Downing Street, and they issued this kind of play nice letter. Now, what that does, it's non-legislative, and it purely is a political rhetoric. But what it also did around the public sector, certainly the central government departments, is it was coupled with an advice note with templates on the side saying, look, if you just squeeze your supply chain to hold the cost of COVID disputes because things were prolonged, you'll force them in to go bust, project doesn't get delivered, taxpayer loses out. So you need to work collaboratively to share the risk. And we have two standard form contracts here. One is extremely adversarial, JCT, black and white. Lots of people love it for that. One is a bit more bureaucratic, but much more collaborative, NEC. So there was a difference in attitude. This idea that philosophically, government is two things. One, it owns the asset after it's been built, so it's an owner-operator. So they look at construction as TOTEX, not just CapEx. The capital expenditure of construction, they look at the operational life as well. But yeah, people did try to work collaboratively. There was the private sector that just went in hard and tried to squeeze. There was many of those examples. What we found is due through 22, when COVID support was removed, is that's when things were starting to hit home. So construction here rides at the top of the insolvency charts. And those numbers are getting bigger and bigger this year in 23 as things can't sustain themselves. One of my medium-sized clients said to me in the middle of 22, I could fill my order book for 2 years solid. There are so many tender inquiries, it's like bulimia. I will go bust within a year because I won't be able to deliver any of it at fixed lump sum prices. Mm-hmm. You've also seen that CLC group that I'm part of monitor those product costs and encourage people to move in the direction of collaborative risk sharing. So Ireland, Northern Ireland, Wales have all put diktats down from a governmental perspective that there is 0 point in trying to ask a supply chain to hold a price for 2 years.
Yeah. So, yeah, because actually that was one of my next questions, was about whether you think there's a trend now towards contractors being more aggressive in negotiations over construction contracts to ensure that they move away from fixed price lump sum and to build in the protections they think they need for price escalation, you know, unavailability of goods, etc. So, you know, more room for EOT claims, more room for additional cost claims, and maybe even a more elaborate force majeure regime. Is that a trend you're seeing there?
Force majeure, yes. We write them so that it's COVID-19, any other outbreak of human disease or mutation thereof kind of thing. So we broadened it out for the next pandemic. Bright and sunny, I know. I guess the biggest worry for the UK at the moment is China-Taiwan. That really would upset construction because of the electrical market, which feeds into everything else. So there is a kind of, how do you future-proof and make your economy resilient? The insolvency bit, I think, is the bit that plays into the viability of disputes. Is there any point in going to adjudication if it's less than 80 grand here? Because the cost of solicitors and barristers, the adjudicator's fee could be exponential. The other side could go and get the most expensive law firm in the world that could arrive with 2 IKEA loads of documents. How do you do that in 28 days? So you don't. And do you dare piss the adjudicator off by saying you can't have an extension of time? Could be on a hiding to nothing. So it's very much around, there's a bit here where above £10,000, below, and I'll move that 80 up to 100, there's an awful lot of debts owed to an awful lot of those tier 3, or 2, 3, and 4 suppliers, which get forgotten about because they're not viable.
Yep. And that no man's land for the smaller contractors was presumably meant to be taken up, at least to an extent, by your low value adjudication scheme. I've actually had a question from the audience about this, which I'll just read out. Interesting point, re the low value adjudication. Are adjudicators and legal representatives willing to accept dictated fees, presumably capped fees or fixed fees? What is the response to this form of adjudication?
Slow take up, because you have to contract into it, or you have to get the contract to specify it will be their set of rules. So adjudication is statutory here, but you can choose to go with a different set of rules. The rules by which you play can either be the statutory default or another set. We are starting to go down the road where we're going to push it even more. Will people accept that their fees can be capped? In theory, why wouldn't you? Because these are it's proportionate to the value of the dispute. So if the dispute is only 100K, one argument is, well, it's a much more simple, less paper-heavy dispute. Why couldn't your fees be proportionate? You're not losing out on work if you're an adjudicator, because you won't get that job anyway, because no one's going to take a 100K dispute to you if your fees are 50K. I know the anti-argument, and I get that too. We've all been an advisor on a claim, and it's very complicated, lots of documents, and then you get to the bottom of it and it's 500 quid. And you think, really? But it's about proportionality. When adjudication first came in here, it was something engineers represented themselves in whilst continuing their day job in their contracting businesses in front of generally quantity surveyors.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to hear that the UK adjudication regime is having this type of challenge now. You know, adjudication was born there. Other jurisdictions around the world have been following very closely for years how your statutory scheme has developed and its implementation. And I think that perhaps outside of the UK, we all have this working assumption that adjudication is a very successful model in the UK. And yet, from what you've said today, it seems that there are some major challenges there. Do you have any views, Rob, on, you know, if you were in the driving seat, and you are, I guess, in the driving seat to a certain extent, given your representation on government policy committees, but if you had the ability to make a decision on, you know, 2 or 3 things you would change to improve adjudication or the implementation of it in the UK, what would that be?
My goal is you don't go to adjudication. You don't go to dispute resolution. You sort it out before then. So one thing that might help explain the context of this is, so as Steph knows, I'm registered blind, so I look at problems in a slightly different way. So when I spent a vast period of, let's say, 25 to 35, answering calls to subcontractors who would all start off with, I need my money back, how can I help? We'd go through a triage process. How desperate are you for the money? What's happened? Has the notice been issued 24 hours after it's supposed to be, in the wrong font, on the wrong print? We can get them smash and grab adjudication. I realized we weren't actually adding any value to the project and the outcome of the construction process. So we went down a road of saying, actually, if you look at our legislation, and it comes, as said, in twin sets, not just adjudication. Adjudication is there to sort out the disputes and payment. Payment, in a very broad sense, has 5 dates: application, due date, doesn't do anything, payment notice date, where a piece of paper comes back to the payee saying how much they should be getting paid. A pay less notice date, same thing happens again, and final date for payment when they get money. Very overcomplicated. That's no different to Amazon. It's a transaction management system with key dates where people talk to each other. So we started to think, all right, if you think about the disputes to go through to adjudication, how many of them about how much you're getting paid? And how many of them are about when you should have been paid? And have they cocked up the procedure under the contract? Because if it's procedural impropriety arguments, that should all be eradicated through digitization. Apps, talk about smart contracts and things like that. The reality there is you take a bit of the contract and you make that smart. So we now have about 2 big players, but about 5 players in the UK. Some out of the US, some out of Australia. I did the original blueprint for it where you would do that. If you get payment transparency, you get more collaboration, trust, less disputes. You increase productivity and profitability within the business. Those notices don't get forgotten about under someone's desk, and you start to streamline. So the route we went down was actually, can you streamline the problem that gives rise to the dispute so you don't get to adjudication? And the bit I mentioned earlier about monitoring payment behaviour, linking that back, we call it the TripAdvisor feedback loop, or eBay, whichever retail example you want to use, that after your purchase or your transaction, you suddenly give feedback so that only the better performers get awarded more work.
Mm.
So you drive behaviour through pull, not push. Because if you just focus on the issues and solutions around how do I get paid, you're just giving somebody a bigger stick to beat each other with in adjudication.
Yeah. Very interesting. Rob, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I'm sure there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to contribute further. Let's move on to John Lancaster in Singapore. John, I know that you have insights to share on the fallout from COVID in the regions where you are most active, which is not just in Asia, but also in the Middle East. And yeah, I'd like you just to take us through some of your thoughts and observations on that and lessons learned. Thanks, John.
Great, absolutely. Great. Tiffany, if it's possible to put my slide deck up, would be great. Thanks. I think if we can go straight on to the second slide. So just to give you a bit of background on myself, as Stephanie mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I'm fundamentally based in Singapore, where I work as a delay analyst. Predominantly, the work that I do is in arbitration. I'll speak a little bit more about that just now. My background is that I came out of the South African EPC industry initially. I'm originally a mechanical engineer, and I spent quite a considerable portion of my earlier career working with companies like Steinmüller, Bateman, and SNC-Lavalin in South Africa. Originally largely on mining and metallurgy projects, but then also, as with Steinmüller, on power projects. And after this, I moved into the international arena a little bit more, where I spent quite a bit of time working for some big international EPCs and EPCMs, such as CBNI, now part of the McDermott Group, Worley Parsons, and Fluor. So that was my background largely before I went into consultancy. I was involved a lot in-house in claim preparations on a number of large projects for those companies, and decided to move into consultancy work where I focus on delay and disruption issues. Now, as I've noted on this slide, largely my work is international arbitration. I've been appointed on about 50 matters. The oil and gas and energy focus that I've got tends to make these some of the larger arbitration values. So that's why probably the count of the number of matters that I'm involved with is not that high. But it raises a bit of a question in that I don't really have any particular preference how my fees are generated in terms of whether they would come from adjudication, from arbitration, or from litigation. Really, I think that the nature of the work that I do is largely the dictator of my focus on arbitration. And why I say that is I've found in the past that adjudication probably doesn't lend itself very well to larger, more complex delay and disruption issues. I have been appointed on occasion as an expert to assist in adjudication. One example, a few years ago on a power station in Singapore, I worked on a IChemE grey book adjudication. I was in the respondent position on that, helping the main contractor against subcontractor claims. And we fell into the typical adjudication ambush where we were presented with a 300 or 400 page quite complex delay and disruption analysis that we had obviously the limited time to respond to. That forced us into a very reactive response, looking at a knockdown approach on their claim. And luckily in this instance, their submission was not of a great quality, and we managed to find quite a few holes in it. But the risk there, I think, is that if a good quality submission is made, properly prepared over a period of time by the claimant, it's very difficult to respond under the adjudication format. I think my other concern with taking the type of work that I do, the delay and disruption component, into an adjudication is that you're sitting in front of a single adjudicator, often appointed by a body, and you have a great degree of risk on the background of that person and their level of understanding of the construction industry. So I think it's not a great forum for the type of work that I do, and I think that's what's led to most of my work being in international arbitration. That being said, we do come across a lot of SOP, security of payment adjudications within the Singapore system, and CEPA adjudications in Malaysia that my quantum colleagues deal with quite significantly. We're finding, I think, a trend, and it probably goes into what Rob was saying in the back end of his presentation, that more and more solicitors and barristers are being called into adjudications to assist their clients. We are seeing a tendency to involve experts more in the adjudication process. And I think that it does really focus on the quantum side of things. We've looked at a number of matters for clients, and the advice we've had for them typically is to go through the claims that they have, and we perform a bit of a separation on items that can go through adjudication for quick turnaround on payment, and items such as this delay and disruption, which are probably better dealt with under an arbitration, or obviously, as Rob said as well, avoiding dispute resolution altogether. So as I've said, I'm a mechanical engineer by background. I dabbled a little bit in AI as it applies to project management as well. And largely what I'm wanting to talk to you about today is what I've seen from COVID-19 claims, some of the lessons that I believe we should take away from that, considering the prospect of future pandemics and other similar issues like the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I think we can move over to the next slide, please. So just to dive into the COVID issue a little bit more, and again, everything I'm saying is painted a little bit with the fact that my background's from an oil and gas sector largely, and delay and disruption. But what we're seeing is COVID presented sort of one of the most challenging and complex events that we have to deal with. We've seen that it basically impacts every aspect of a construction project and at every phase. So going right through engineering, procurement, and into construction and commissioning. And each of these different phases that it's impacted have had their own different sort of characteristics that have to be dealt with. And I think each jurisdiction, this is the other problem that we've faced, is that if you're working on a matter that's purely in one geographical region, you've got one set of restrictions being imposed by government bodies to deal with. But very few projects these days, particularly large energy projects, if you look at the recent large power projects in South Africa, a lot of the equipment's being sourced overseas. A lot of the large contractors are Japanese. So there's numerous jurisdictions on pretty much every major undertaking that have to be considered. And each of those have got significantly different impacts in terms of lockdown and that type of thing. So it becomes a very, very complex undertaking to dig through all the different facets of the COVID-19 delay and disruptions. What we've seen is, and I'll expand on this a little bit more later, but you have to look at the timing of the different events. Some of them are very discrete. The actual lockdown periods, I know in South Africa that the lockdown was fairly limited, the absolute lockdown, but in other regions and other countries, we've had much longer lockdowns. Singapore, for example, experienced almost a total outage on construction projects for about 3 months. So that obviously has a significant effect. The upside of it is that it's very easy to define and very easy to demonstrate the impact. What I've done is I've just used one of the projects that I worked on recently just to try and illustrate a little bit the complexity that we're dealing with. So maybe if we could move to the over to the next slide. This project was for a floating storage and offloading vessel that was being fabricated in Malaysia for deployment offshore in Vietnam. And we put together one of these fishbone diagrams just to try. This was one of the first COVID-19 claims that we were presented with. And we put this together just to try and sort of map out in our minds the complexity and the various different moving parts of the project that were being impacted by COVID. So we tried to look at, I'm not going to take you through each and every one, but this particular project had engineering in Singapore and Malaysia. Some of this engineering was hit very early in January 2020 when some of the cases started coming in, although we had low initial case statistics in Singapore. The Singaporean government reacted very quickly, so some of the restrictions started to come in early, and working from home was being progressively introduced in January 2020. So we were seeing some of the buildup of engineering delays right from the very onset of COVID. Just by the way, a number of the projects that came across our desk had engineering offices in Wuhan, which was obviously the one of the first places to get hit. So we saw engineering on a number of projects really being impacted at an early stage. But then obviously we've got procurement, issues with procurement coming in from vendors in numerous different jurisdictions. So each faced with their own lockdown measures. Fabrication actually on site, complete shutdown of the yards, and then subsequently restrictions on labor, social distancing, that type of thing. And then going towards the back end when it's going into commissioning, issues such as vendors normally have to, if they've supplied pumps or rotating equipment, something like that, typically a vendor representative will be required on site in order to commission the item. And towards the back end, we were seeing lots of issues. As we were coming out to the main thrust of COVID, there was still a lot of travel restrictions, and a number of the projects we worked on, we saw continued delays at the back end with not being able to get these vendor specialists to site. And typically the vendors have to perform this commissioning function, otherwise there's warranty issues that come into play. So all sorts of different facets, and this was really just to explain how complex it was. Typically on a project we'll have some of these same issues, but the interaction and just the sort of widespread impact of these different items was something that we'd not really dealt with before. Maybe we can move to the next slide. So then just to look at it a little bit more, one of the other dimensions of the complexity that was being dealt with here, we produced actually a document like the one that you can see the extract from here, just to map out the different government restrictions that were put in place by different countries. And what you can see from this is, we don't have to go into each of these boxes to see exactly what they were, but each of these represents different degrees of lockdown, different social distancing restrictions. We had an issue in Singapore where we have a lot of foreign workers in the country, and there was the breakout in the hostels. So we had restrictions on the hostel workers being released. So all of these facets just add to the complexity of the overall delays and disruptions that are being experienced by contractors on the project. So I think if we can go to the next slide. What I've been noting, we've had a few cases that have gone through the complete arbitration process. And obviously it was a bit, the expectations, I think, from a lot of contractors were that we've got this big issue that's a global pandemic, and pretty much this is going to provide us with an umbrella where during this whole period we're going to be absolved of any sins, basically, by COVID. But what we've found is that the acceptance by tribunals in arbitration is not quite that easy. There's a lot of sympathy towards contractors, I think, that were experienced in the early phases of COVID, where particularly in lockdown, it's pretty absolute. It's pretty difficult to argue with the fact that in the second quarter of 2020, that pretty much the construction industry was crippled at that stage, and not a lot of useful productivity was coming out in that time. But we've noticed that as you start to move away from that red band in this diagram, and this is trying to show the sort of extent of disruption, with red being the sort of most disrupted, and the lighter color showing less and less disruption as time goes on. As we move away from that red band, we found that the tribunals are expecting and testing the contractors' claims, so expecting a lot more rigor in their claims and testing them a lot further. So just saying that productivity has been reduced in a period where there was social distancing wasn't satisfying them, but they were looking for more rigor and at least a reasonable demonstration that the contractor or its experts, me in that case, had done the best they could to separate the effects of COVID from other productivity losses, and to demonstrate that this wasn't just poor performance. So I think if you consider just going back to Rob's presentation, he showed the curve for the impact to the economy, and I think largely it lines up with the red and yellow portions here, with the big hit to the economy coming in the second quarter of 2020, and largely the economy sort of coming back to where it was by the beginning of 2021. And I think that's exactly what I've seen with the impact of and disruptions coming from COVID, that first year, 2020, really contains the majority of it. Some of the other things that are spilling over beyond that period of time are issues such as the vendor assistance on site that I spoke about a little bit earlier. And one issue that we do find, which is particularly difficult to demonstrate, is a knock-on effect in the supply chains. And what I mean by that, a lot of vendors will have differing degrees of relationships with their customers. And what we found after COVID was a prioritization with the vendors on their better customers. So the large entities, like one in particular, my client was suffering from being pushed to the back of the queue in favor of ExxonMobil. A lot of that was happening, and what that means is that these knock-on effects of the COVID delays just get amplified. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. So I think this is reiterating a lot of what I've said. General sympathy towards the contractors, I think, in the early stages, but after that period, they're really testing the contractors to demonstrate that they've removed any other productivity losses and delays that they may have incurred through other sources from COVID, and it's not just an umbrella for them to hide all, where they can put all of their pain and suffering and expect relief. What we did find was that when we were trying to dig into that and do that separation, that the record keeping really wasn't sufficiently detailed. And I think largely a lot of that was due to this expectation that we've got a get out of jail free card. We don't really have to go into all of the nuts and bolts of our claims. We can get away with just blaming COVID. So I think that's one of the key lessons that I would take out of COVID, is that going into any future pandemics, that there has to be better documentation. And I think issues like exploring delays with vendors and working closer with them during these periods to make sure that the effects of COVID have been properly documented is something that we would have to consider. Rob also raised a point about foreseeability briefly, and looking at where we are in the world, and we've seen that with tribunals as well. That as time's moved on through the sort of COVID timeline, they're not accepting that you couldn't see COVID coming, because some of the projects had started in the back end of COVID, or even within a single project, they had an expectation that you would start to plan for it, knowing what you know at the time, and that you can start to look at some of the later implications of COVID and start to moderate or modify your approach to execution, taking those into account. So I think if we were to go into another pandemic, there's a sort of expectation of some form of learning, that we would go in that with a more informed view of how to manage a project through these sort of restrictions. And I think this will also manifest itself a little bit in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A lot of similarities in the supply chain disruptions that would have to be considered. And maybe we can just jump on to the next slide. So what I've laid out here, and I was pleased to see that this did actually also tie into what Rob mentioned on a number of the particular commodities that are being limited, is some of the items that we're seeing having an issue in terms of supply chains. And as Rob said, a lot of it's raw materials going into other finished and semi-finished products. And from my side on the oil and gas, things like nickel, obviously affecting stainless steel production. So that's a big thing. Any limitation on that in the marketplace is going to have quite widespread impact. And obviously, again, the electronic devices, every process plant that's being constructed, and not only process plants, pretty much these days, the control system, there's a big control system sitting behind hospitals, rail, hotels. All of these have significant reliability on electronic devices. So any limitation in that has a massive knock-on effect into the market. So we're going to be seeing all of these issues coming into the general process of progressing a project and having an impact. And I think what becomes difficult from the perspective of maybe a main contractor, they may have had issues with piping supply from a vendor, but not having the transparency and the visibility on exactly how the stainless steel supply chain is impacting the piping vendor. And I think that's where the tie-up has to come in, maybe some back-to-back agreements with the vendors to try and get a little bit more transparency and visibility on the underlying causes of delay. We can maybe go to the next slide. So we have started to see, my view of the world's always a little bit delayed, because it takes, the arbitration process takes a fair amount of time to come sort of into fruition and for me to get involved. So we're only just seeing the sort of the tip of the iceberg, I think, in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict coming through into international arbitration. We are seeing most of this in form of escalation at the moment. And I think just another point that I'd pick up on from Rob's presentation, as he said, I think in the UK construction industry, the average duration of a project is about 18 months. What we see with oil and gas and energy, I think we're the outlier to the right-hand side of that. Power plants, oil refineries, and large floating assets would typically fall in the sort of 24 to 48 months range. So I think escalation is a larger risk on those type of projects. And it's outside my expertise, but I think contractual provisions to deal with escalation on those type of projects are obviously even more fundamental. So I think, as I've said, some of the lessons learned from COVID, particularly in how you assess the disruption and delays in the supply chain, will apply equally to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And it's not straightforward in the face of these widespread delays that we're seeing. As I mentioned already, vendors tend to prioritize some of their larger clients, which can really amplify the delays very difficult to actually prove and demonstrate. So it's something that needs consideration when you are putting in delay claims or disruption claims caused by the disruption in the supply chain. And it's never going to be easy to absolutely separate things like COVID or the Russia-Ukraine conflict from other sources. But I think what the tribunals that I'm being in front of are expecting is at least a reasonable attempt or demonstration of a reasonable attempt to show that you have taken out other causes. So if you've had design changes in the process of procurement, you've taken that into account and tried to remove that a sort of modified total cost approach where you at least take out items that you know about and then say, well, the rest must be due to COVID. I think in some instances that's probably an acceptable approach because it's very hard to be completely definitive over these type of impacts. Okay, I think that's actually the end of my slides for now, so I'm happy to explore any points further or take any questions.
Thanks, John. That's brilliant. Let me put my video back on here. There we go. So really interesting to hear about all of those challenges from the point of view of very much the delays that were caused to projects as a result of COVID and how complicated that has been. And I get the sense that some of those disputes are even still running now. You know, there are those of us. There are those of us down here, I think, who kind of forgot a little bit about COVID not so long ago. And we feel like it's business as usual. But of course, on very large projects, I'm sure those claims are still ongoing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's definitely correct. We've got a number of matters at the moment that we're dealing with. There's still COVID's the majority of the impacts, and I think this is one thing probably with the arbitration industry and the way it's going at the moment. I've just finished one matter that I was appointed as the expert for a period of 5 years. It was a construction of a refinery with a duration of 48 months. It took 60 months to conclude the arbitration hearings, and we are now waited 18 months after that for an award. So with those sort of timeframes, you know, you're seeing significant lag on the actual finalization of a lot of these issues. And so, yeah, COVID's very much topical still for us.
Yeah. So I want to just return to something you said about seeing a real push for additional levels of rigor in terms of demonstrating the link between, in this case, COVID being the event and the impact that it had, and not sort of using COVID claims to cover up or hide poor performance on the part of a contractor. And I was just reflecting on that in the context of what we will probably see coming through in the next few months and maybe even years in relation to the fallout from the Ukraine war, where already we're seeing contractors, when acting for employers, we're seeing contractors, even major global contractors, coming forward and saying, look, yes, I know the war is foreseeable. I mean, it's not just foreseeable, it is here, it exists. We're all dealing with it. But that doesn't mean to say that I understand fully every implication of the war on my supply chain or on my transport options, etc. Or obviously on pricing as well. But sticking with I guess supply chain issues and transport issues and delays generally, which is very much your field. I'm wondering, you know, if you could give advice to contractors sitting now looking at what's happening around the world as a result of the war, you know, are there any kind of key things you would say to them to kind of put them in the right position, the strongest position to be able to bring forward a claim in the future linked to this, bearing in mind what you learned from COVID claims?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, one of the simplest things is documentation. It's really as these events unfold, and as you say, it's very difficult with any of these things to foresee all of the different facets of how these these issues are going to manifest on a project. But I think what it is really addressing when you face some of these issues is making sure that they're fully documented. Once you start to experience transportation issues, you see that the raw materials are not flowing into your vendors. It's talking with those vendors and the transport agents and actually making sure that you've got these delays fully documented, because we've been trying to do this retrospectively, and unfortunately a lot of people have had the view that they'll be able to just say that it's COVID or it's Russia-Ukraine issues, and that's, as I say, that's not the case. So I think having these properly documented to the extent possible, and also taking note of any other, as I said before, any other issues that may have caused impact to the same processes. So if you've, as I said, had a design change or something which might compete with the issues caused by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, for example, make sure that those are documented as well, so that it's easy to exclude those from your overall claim. You can then demonstrate to the tribunal that you're taking a reasonable approach. You're not just trying to throw this total cost, total loss approach at them, and you've done whatever is possible to break that claim down and exclude anything which might be non-COVID or non-Russia-Ukraine related. So I think that's the key. Reasonableness, I think where you can demonstrate you've done what's reasonably possible, you've taken a proactive approach to sort of really documenting the issues, you've got good records. That's really, I think, what's fundamental to success in these proceedings.
Yeah.
And I think that probably applies equally to adjudication, arbitration, or litigation. You know, it's very much the cause and effect relationship being demonstrated to the best degree possible.
Yes, indeed. And what about mitigation, John? I mean, you must have seen in the COVID claims a lot of focus on, you know, what could the contractor have done, what should the contractor have done to mitigate the delay? Are there some lessons learned there as well in the context of claims in relation to the war?
There are definitely, and it's quite an interesting point, because I recently had a quite a unique sort of experience where I was appointed on 2 arbitrations back to back for identical assets, the fabrication of 2 identical assets. But these were actually put in front of 2 different tribunals, both very senior tribunals. And one of the issues that we were looking at, without giving away too much, one of the issues that we were looking at is exactly what the contractor could have done during COVID in relation to planning and trying to mitigate. And one of the points that I had to address was the fact that even though the balance at the time, we were looking at largely at the period of 2020, and although at the time we didn't know what the future of COVID was and how long this was going to run for, I was giving evidence that it didn't excuse the contractor from not providing his best forecast. And the reason that I was presenting that was because at any given time when you want to mitigate, you need to know where your critical path is. And the only time you can know where your critical path is if you understand the progress that you've made to date. This was put to the tribunals in both instances, that it's important to keep an updated schedule, even though you're in the middle of this turmoil or whatever you want to call it, so that if you then get a release of resources that you want to apply to the project to try and mitigate the delay or to contain there being any further delay, you understand at that given moment where the criticality lies, where you need to apply your resources in order to limit the impact of the event going forward. And the interesting thing was that in these 2 arbitrations, the fact and my evidence was almost identical, and the response from the tribunal was almost black and white. One tribunal basically couldn't get beyond the point that you were in a period of unknown delay, and they just couldn't absorb the fact that you could plan under those sort of circumstances. The other tribunal totally bought into the point that you can do that. You can know where you are. You may not know what's coming in the future, but you know where you are. You know what's critical to you, and that's important to a properly managed mitigation process. And it brought home the point to me that how important it is when you are considering your dispute resolution, probably the format, and also the people that you're going to be sitting in front of, because having people with significant construction experience, and particularly where you can find they're fairly rare, but there's a few of them out there, lawyer engineers that sit on tribunals, your reception and their understanding of the issues is so much greater, and it is really important. And it's as I said in my opening, I think it's one reason why I think adjudication doesn't really lend itself to delay and disruption, because you've got one man, often appointed by a body, and you have limited control over his background and experience. And it's very, very risky. I think taking delay and disruption cases in front of a single person like that can be a significant risk.
Okay, I think that's a potentially explosive comment there,
yes,
which
no,
I know looking at the participants with us today, I'm sure somebody somewhere is going to perhaps put their hand up and say something further on that. So yep. I'll leave that maybe for the Q&A. Just a final thing before we move to John Arat is just to ask you, John Lancaster, what are the construction markets looking like in the regions where you're active, Asia, Middle East, etc.? What are they looking like at the moment? With people exiting from the impacts of COVID, now obviously dealing with other macroeconomic problems in the world. What is the landscape like for those markets at the moment?
I think it's looking very good. If you look around, I predominantly, most of my work's in APAC in the Middle East. And if you look at the two separately, what we're seeing, I think in APAC, we're seeing a lot of investment in renewable energy. We're seeing a lot of wind projects in Taiwan, in Vietnam, in Laos. A lot of solar work going off in those regions as well. Singapore and Indonesia are looking at some fairly unique floating solar farms. So we're seeing a lot going into renewables. At the same time, it's clear there's still a lot of coal knocking around in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of fossil fuel power stations going up in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and in Vietnam. We're seeing a lot of transportation projects, large investments going into rail. I think there's something like 80 big rail projects going off in Southeast Asia. Quite a lot of airport work, which is coming up. India investing quite heavily in airport expansions, and the Chinese as well, big expansions on the Pudong airport in just outside Shanghai. Multiple billion, I think that's about a $15 billion project. So the market generally is looking quite buoyant. We're seeing a lot of new projects coming up. For us, unfortunately, it takes a while for those to filter through to us, but the work is commencing, and it's looking quite strong. I think if we move over to the Middle East, from an oil and gas perspective, we saw a little bit of a slow take up on some new projects just after COVID. But there's, I believe, 621 identified projects in the Middle East, oil and gas projects in the Middle East, that are going to be undertaken between 2023 and 2027, which some are very significant. Qatar has the North Field expansion project, which is a big LNG gas facility expansion, which I think is sitting at $29 billion. So it's a very large undertaking. And then obviously the hot topic in the Middle East really is Saudi Arabia, with just phenomenal investment going on there. And the one project which I think has really generated a lot of excitement is the NEOM project, the sort of dedicated city with the long linear city structure. And one interesting statistic that I heard on that, it's a $500 billion overall project. One of the statistics that I heard, I haven't checked the facts on this, but is that at peak resource levels, the NEOM project would use resources equal to the entire Western European contracting capacity. So something like that's not easily absorbed into the industry without a lot of ramifications around the world. And that project even's not in isolation. Saudi's investing heavily in tourism. They've got this big Red Sea development project. And with tourism, they're pretty much coming from ground zero, really, and working up. So there's huge investment going into tourism, sports and leisure facilities, and also looking at other, apart from NEOM, looking at other forms of sort of new ideas on residential projects. So that they've got another one, the name escapes me, 200 million square meter development of residential property and sort of common green areas. So there's all sorts of different projects, and obviously all of these generate energy requirements. So there's a lot of renewable energy projects. I think a total of 70 gigawatts of renewable energy just to supply NEOM. So generally, I think the landscape's looking pretty good, and I think with NEOM coming out, once it gets to sort of full resource level, we're going to feel the pinch right through the industry, right across the board. I think that's going to have a ripple effect into a number of different regions as resources sort of migrate into Saudi Arabia. A lot of our competitors and a lot of legal firms that we see are moving into Saudi Arabia and setting up offices and in the country so that they can start to deal with obviously all of the influx of disputes that are inevitable to arise.
Okay, John, thanks so much for your inputs today and for giving us that that interesting overview of markets where you're active. I think it's a good time now. We're at 10:30 to move over to our second John, which is John Arat in Istanbul. And John, sorry that we had you on mute for so long. We're looking forward to your contribution. Maybe we should start before you do your formal presentation by just asking you, in the same way as I asked John Lancaster, what's happening in the Turkish construction market at the moment, because I'm sure many of the participants today won't have a lot of knowledge of that, and not just Turkey, obviously any other neighbouring countries in your region. What's happening?
Sure. Let me begin with saying that I've had great pleasure in listening both Rob and John Lancaster. So no worries about keeping me on mute. But what I can tell you about the construction market, the industry in Turkey and neighboring countries is this. Well, I think aside from the global trends that affects almost every country, Turkey has, two, maybe three main issues that it's dealing with. One of them is, we have just been through two elections, and another election is on the way. So during those election times, the whole trade, including the construction market, it seems to, slow down. But aside from that, maybe related to the elections, we are suffering from huge inflation rates. So much so that for political reasons, apparently, we cannot even get the right inflation rates from the governmental institutions. So the official rate that we have is, I just put it there, yes, it's 48%, whereas an independent, credible group of economists constitute an association called ENAG, and their calculations say that we are, the inflation rate is 113% currently. So I don't think I need to tell you how serious that is. So life is getting more expensive every day, and the construction industry is definitely getting its share out of it. And the third point is, probably you've heard about the earthquake, earthquakes, two devastating earthquakes happened one after the other, and it affected, that happened in February, and it affected 5 different cities, but almost demolished one of them entirely. So those all had negative impacts on both the Turkish economy in general, but the construction industry. Of course, it also, opens up this earthquake, for example. It means new business for those cities, mostly residential projects and infrastructure. So there is some development there. But aside from, that, it looks like Turkey is still investing in renewable energy. So we are now expecting a set of new tenders to be announced for offshore wind projects. And investments are still going on the healthcare front. And let me see, on the transportation part as well. So and why I think multilateral banks are still committed to the market, even though it costs much more these days. You can still have access to financing through those multilateral banks. So that is what has been going on with Turkey, with neighboring countries, or faraway countries. To add to what John Lancaster had said, I represent clients in the Gulf region and in the especially in Saudi Arabia. So we see a lot of water desalination projects, pipelines, huge pipelines, and that's I think a new wave that Turkish contractors are trying to capitalize on. And there are some projects in Georgia, renewable energy projects, as well as wastewater treatment plants. And those projects are generally financed by multilaterals like the EBRD or EIB. So I see a lot of Turkish contractors participating in those tenders and sometimes getting a contract. So that's what I can tell you about the general outlook.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? Because the Turkish contractors really do get around, don't they? They must be one of the top 3, top 5 contracting groups in the world who are mobile, and literally every corner of the globe you'll find a Turkish contractor who's prepared, particularly for larger scale projects, to get involved in that. Includes, of course, here in Africa, particularly Northern Africa. You mentioned, John, just before we go to your slides, that you had a client or two who's even still trying to deliver projects in Ukraine. Is that right?
That is correct. They are, they're one of those contractors that did not leave the country entirely. They're still there, and they continued making progress with the works under very dire circumstances, as you can imagine. But I know that the problem, for example, with their employer and their contract is not that they cannot get the EOT. They get their extensions easily, but they cannot get the money. So the last time, and I checked this yesterday with them, the last time they were paid was December 2022. So they're still holding on there, probably also because this probably this is interpreted as an opportunity as well, because Mr. Zelensky has once announced that the countries that remained in Ukraine will get preferential treatment after the war. So I believe that some contractors are trying to capitalize on that, but it's very difficult for those for those contractors.
Yeah. Okay. John, thanks for giving us that overview. Let me allow you now to jump onto your slides.
Sure.
John's going to tell us about how adjudication, construction adjudication works in the Turkish market, and the realities of that. So John, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephanie. Let me begin with a little bit of background information. I am John Arat, and I'm a partner with the Tuga Arat law firm. We're operating out of two offices. One is based in Istanbul, and the other one is in Ankara. What we do is, as Stephanie said in the very beginning, there are not too many law firms that are, that practice in the construction sector, specifically in Turkey. So what we do is we advise clients on both the contentious and non-contentious matters. And when you're dealing, and most of what we do is based on FIDIC forms of contracts, and I'll get to that in a minute, why that is the case. But when you're dealing with FIDIC forms of contracts in construction, it's inevitable that often you run into dispute adjudication boards and arbitration. Tiffany, can we move on to the next slide? Thank you. So let me begin by saying that there is no statutory adjudication in Turkey. So whatever adjudication process you see in this market is based on some sort of contractual structure. So when I say contractual structure, I specifically refer to FIDIC form of contracts. Why? Because, well, the Turkish contractors in doing business overseas have been historically exposed to those contracts, even as early as late 50s and early 60s, with the very first edition of FIDIC contracts. And then that experience of the Turkish contractors were later reinforced by the presence of multilateral banks in Turkey, and then since 2007 by a very specific framework or a financial assistance tool called IPA. Now, I will try to limit the scope of my presentation and my observations to this IPA framework, and I will explain why I think it is important in a minute. But let me begin with explaining what it is. So IPA stands for the Instrument for Pre-Accession Assistance. And that is a fancy way of saying that European Union provides financial assistance to the candidate and potential candidate countries for EU membership. And Turkey has been one of those potential candidates. And since 2007, back in 2007, the Turkish government signed a framework agreement with the European Union, and that's how we were introduced to this system. Now, next one, please, Tiffany. Thank you. So since 2007, approximately 900 projects have been funded under this framework. While some of those projects, some of those contracts are what can be considered internationally as large contracts, most of them are small and medium-sized contracts. So this in turn attracted small and medium-sized contractors. Now, I find this important because those are the players, the SMEs on the contractor side, and the employers here in this framework are four different ministries: the Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Transportation, and Ministry of Trade. Now, what happens is the European Union basically channels the money to the Turkish treasury, which then transfers certain portions of it to these 5 different ministries. And those ministries are the employers in the contract. But usually there is an end recipient, usually another state-owned entity or a governmental authority like a municipality. So the project is undertaken on behalf of the end recipient, but that's how it works. Now, I find this important because those players, the ministries and the SME contractors, they were, before 2007, they were never exposed to a FIDIC contract or concepts such as dispute adjudication or arbitration. So this is the game changer for those players. Now, what I have seen since 2007, well, and out of these 900 projects, many disputes have arisen. I have personally been involved in perhaps more than 20-25, so I think I can whatever I'm going to say is based on my personal observation, my experience, but I think I can generalize them to the rest of the framework. So what I have seen is that the contractors were unequipped, but since 2007, they were agile and they adapted themselves. Their human resources evolved, and they learned how to, pay for those services and react to the needs of the contract and the demands of the employer in a very speedy manner. Whereas the problem largely lies still with the ministries who are that suffer from bureaucratic that suffer from bureaucracy in general. They are not usually very proactive. For example, I'm trying to constitute a DAB against one of those ministries, and we served them with a notice of dispute. That was a week ago, and we also provided 2 alternative names as for DAB membership, and they did not even consider it. What they do is they don't consider whatever the contractor is proposing, and they don't have a counter offer either. So what they do is we think it's best that the appointing entity appoints the DAB member. So that's how they react. They don't want to take any initiative. That is probably because state officials in Turkey in general are very reluctant to take initiative. So it's best for them to say, I'm not going to sign this settlement agreement that says we're going to pay you 1 million euros. I'd rather be told to do that by a judicial authority, for example. So that's the approach they have. But I think the biggest problem with these employers, these ministries, lies with the fact that they have evolved in the last 15-16 years to view and treat dispute adjudication process not as a tool to resolve their disputes, but as a tool to stall the whole dispute resolution process, to lengthen the process. And so it's for them, it's basically a tactical tool. And we'll get to that. I'll give you an example during the discussion part. Engineers, well, I cannot say much about engineers. I think they are operating within the expected standards under this IPA framework. One final remark on the appointing entity. So the appointing body in Turkey in those contracts under the IPA framework, it's the Association of Turkish Consulting Engineers and Architects. So that is the association that's affiliated with FIDIC. So that's why they're there. But I have serious doubts or let's say criticism for their transparency, because there is a list of potential DAB members, but you don't know how those individuals were admitted into that list. What are the criteria? How can you volunteer, write my name on the list as well? It's just no one answers you. They don't have public objective criteria announced for the public. So that is a problem, another problem that we're suffering in the dispute adjudication process in Turkey. So I think, Tiffany, can we move on to the next slide? And that is, yes, I think I'll just stop here. And because I've covered these as well, let's get on to the discussion part. Perhaps I'll try to explain briefly the approach of the general approach from the employers under these IPA frameworks through a phone conversation that I had 3 days ago with one of those representatives of the engineer, if that is okay, Stephanie.
Yes, please go ahead.
So we're, as I told you, we have a dispute and we're trying to constitute a DAB, and we served our notice of dispute, and the employer replied, well, let the appointing body appoint the DAB member. And that's what we did. And we received a name. That gentleman sent us an email with, with the attachment of the draft dispute adjudication agreement. And in the agreement, in this draft agreement, I saw his daily fee, which I think is quite normal in the international standards, but it's relatively, well, 30 to 35% more than what we're accustomed to see in the Turkish market. And so I did not want to handle this directly with the DAB member, potential DAB member. So I called the employer's representative and we had this discussion. He said, well, first, and I saw that when I think it was during Rob's presentation, somebody from the audience asked about the dictated fees. So this gentleman said, Mr. Arat, we don't care about how much we pay hourly or daily to the DAB member. We don't care how many days he is going to spend. We just care that he agrees to the capped fee we have in our heads. So, and the capped fee is, as you can imagine, it's quite low. And then he said, either he agrees to what we have in mind, or we'll ask for reappointment. And I can tell that the employer was wishing that he doesn't, the potential DAB member doesn't agree to their terms, because that would mean another additional week or 10 days. Then he went on to say that this, Mr. Arat, whatever the DAB decides, that we're not going to honor that decision, right? We are just going to refer the matter to arbitration. And this is, he put it very bluntly, and I'm very sorry that I'm also being very blunt here, but this is the case. This is not to say that dispute adjudication does not work in the Turkish market. There are some success stories. For example, in early 2000s, there was this major railway project called Marmaray project. And there was a standing DAB there. And for 8 years, it worked perfectly. But under this IPA framework, we see a lot of disputes. We see a lot of dispute adjudication processes. And unfortunately, most of them, if not all of them, are treated that way, in this tactical manner. So that is one remark I wanted to make about the dispute adjudication in Turkey. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah, so John, I'm just conscious of time now, and your presentation is giving rise to several questions actually from the audience, which is great. But before I jump onto those, I just wanted to get to the heart of why is it that you have so many employers who are simply saying, I don't really want to participate in this adjudication process. And even if we do it, I'm going to ignore the outcome. That must surely be driven by the approach to enforcement in Turkey. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Sure. You're right. It's directly related to the enforceability issue. So in Turkey, the Turkish legal system allows you to enforce. There are two methods of enforcement. One, enforcement with a judicial decision, and without. Now, the judicial decision enforcement based on judicial processes, it's very effective. It's very fast. You can just apply for the enforcement of the decision, and you can have it enforced within days. Now, but the problem is the Turkish legal system says that that decision must be a product of a judicial process, and judicial process is defined as either state court litigation or arbitration. So an entirely contractual mechanism such as dispute adjudication is not granted that treatment. So you cannot have it enforced, unfortunately. You can try the other method, but that would take 2 years. And why would you spend 2 years and a lot of money trying to have that DAB decision enforced, where you're halfway through and just refer the matter to the arbitration and get it over with perhaps in 6 months or within a year, to be more realistic.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because in your case, there's no statutory scheme, obviously, and your courts won't enforce adjudication decisions. And that then leads directly to, a real weakness in your adjudication practice. Whereas, by comparison, we've got Rob sitting in the UK, where according to a conversation I had with Rob before this seminar, around 95% of adjudications are not challenged. So if you can afford to get to adjudication and you get an outcome, then in the vast majority of cases, those outcomes are adhered to. I don't know what the statistics are in South Africa. We don't have a statutory scheme here, but our courts do honour adjudication decisions. So I guess we could debate for quite some time how Turkey could change both its legislative arrangements and the approach of the courts and the culture of employers to improve on the situation. But can I, in the time we have left, I just want to pick up on a couple of questions that we got from the audience, John, for you, John Arat. One of them is going back to the comment about very high rates of inflation. How are contractors in Turkey handling those, 50-60% inflation rates? Does there not come a point where it's just not economically viable to continue with a project? And with that question in mind, it makes me think, if you applied that question in the context of, say, a FIDIC force majeure clause, could you get to a point where you say, look, the price escalation here is just so exceptional that I can no longer continue to provide the works?
Well, let me begin with the first one. How are they handling inflation rates? They're not. Well, we see a surge in the price escalation cases, both before the state courts and if it's the project is within this IPA framework, sometimes before the DABs as well. But I think the problem is mostly with the small guys, the SMEs. They're struggling, and we see an increasing number of insolvencies, and that is I think bound to happen. If contractors, Turkish contractors who have the ability to go overseas and get contracts by which they can get paid in foreign currency, they're in better shape to manage these risks. But for the other ones, it's a nightmare, and we have to keep going through this nightmare. Unfortunately, the Turkish government has not entirely returned to orthodox economic policies yet, so we don't know what to expect in the near future. But I would say that we're going to see an increasing number of insolvent contractors. So about your question, well, yes, we see claims and even cases for price escalation, some of them under the FIDIC contracts. But don't forget that the local law has a say in it, and we have our restrictions, and I think it's quite new. We will see how the judges and the arbitrators will respond to that. I can report 2 DAB decisions that approved price escalation claims, but those are just 2. So we will in the next couple of months, I think I will have more to report on that. But we'll see. It remains to be seen.
Okay, and here's another one for you, John. So in the context of FIDIC contracts, there's obviously a lot of what you said today is based on the FIDIC forms of contract and the dispute resolution clauses there, because it is the main form of contract which is actually imposed on parties where you have EU funding. In South Africa, the comment made from the audience, which I agree with, is that in South Africa, the uptake of the new FIDIC, the 2017 editions, has been slow. And this audience member suggests that it's too complex and maybe too sophisticated for South African contractors. What's your experience there in Turkey and in the wider region there? Are people using the 2017 edition?
I have absolutely no experience. We are still dealing with 99 edition. So I have not personally been exposed to the new edition, and I have not seen or heard any projects, at least in Turkey, that made use of the new versions, new editions. So sorry, I cannot comment on that.
Well, I think that speaks for itself, doesn't it? That nobody has the appetite for the new edition.
But maybe John Lancaster, I don't know, maybe he has seen.
Yeah, that's a fair question, I think, for John Lancaster as well.
But I think you're on mute, John.
Yeah, I've got myself off. I think I can echo the same thing. Really, I've not had any first-hand experience of working with the 2017. A lot of the contracts that we work with are bespoke contracts based on the 1999, I think, where they've been tweaked. But I've heard very similar comments to the question that was raised by one of the audience members, that it's very complex and that a lot of the good elements of 1999 are not quite so clear anymore. But again, I haven't had any first-hand experience with working with it.
Yeah, and actually from my side, although I agree certainly in a South African context, I'm not sure we've used it at all in South Africa yet, but outside of South Africa, in other countries in Southern Africa, we are actually using it. So why that has come about, I don't know. But we in the next couple of years will at least have some experience, probably warts and all, of using that suite, and we'll be able to do a sort of proper compare and contrast. Okay.
Can I just have 1 minute? I another question, I think, from Diana, about the
yes, please. Yep.
Well, I think the Turkish market handled that quite well. Well, with architects, I have not seen architects appointed as DAB members in the Turkish market, but lawyers lawyers tried to hijack the DAB process, as Rob put it, in Turkey. That was the case in Turkey, but I think that was balanced thanks to the efforts of engineers. And now, if we're not talking about a case like price escalation, where legal theories must be interpreted or argued, then I would say that 90% of the time I would see engineers, technical people, sitting as DAB members. So that is my experience with the Turkish market, and they're good.
Okay, I think, and we're actually running over, but most people are staying on board, so that's a good sign that we're getting something right here. I think we can probably eke out 1 or 2 further questions before we close. Juliet de Hutton asked if Rob could expand a little bit on the measures in the UK for dealing with retentions, and I know she's asking that question, Rob, because it's a hot topic here as well. So
okay,
please, if you can just give us a couple of
retentions
more
date back to post railway industrial revolution in the UK, so Victorian plus times. Cash retentions is the real bit. So you can have retention bonds. Nobody does them in the UK, because why would you, if you can retain someone else's cash in your bank account and part of your working capital? The problem is, you have to wait for a landmark crisis point in the industry, and our one was Carillion, where you can ask government for reform. Because if you hold on to 5%, and it's roughly 5 or 3% in the UK, of the contract value that is withheld from every interim payment as retentions, there is no protection on that cash. It can be used for anything if I'm the one withholding it in my working capital. So currently there's nothing there. We have rowed about it for 30 years because in my economic analysis, that is 5% from everybody down the chain. I gave you 2.5% annual profit margin. So you're already in a negative space almost. And the smaller you go, the more you get towards people that simply can't afford it. It is money off the table in terms of their food bills. So we are looking around. Now, the anti-argument for reform on retentions is we'll get rid of retentions when you stop building defective assets. All assets have defects in them because that's what snagging is. So we move to a different place. where January 2018, we had a landmark moment. Carillion went bust. Carillion showed up. They were one of the biggest. They were a massive public sector contractor. You couldn't get through this industry without working for them at the time. However, they had extended their payment terms to 120 days, which meant they were borrowing finance at zero cost from their 3,000 subcontractor supply chain into their own business to prop up their accounts. And when they went bust at that scale, they took all the retentions with them. Household name that would never go wrong. So it really did expose the fragility of the supply chain from a monetary perspective. There are two camps in the UK. One says abolish it, but you'll always find you get the law slightly drafted wrong and there'll be a loophole somewhere. So does abolition work? What are the unintended consequences is the worry of a civil servant. Or the other camp which says don't get rid of them, just stick them in a protected account, like a performance bond. So take them out of the custodian, because the inherent conflict of interest there is I'm holding on to the cash, so I'm the custodian and I'm the claimant. Well, how does that make sense? Whereas performance bond, it goes to somewhere else and they have to prove that you've cocked up before I can make a claim on it, or it automatically gets released. So we're looking at a system like that. Some people call it in the UK a tenancy deposit scheme. Go and have a look at the Construction Act in New Zealand that kicks off in October this year, where they tried a statutory system where those funds could commingle in working capital, but they would be a deemed trust. Didn't work in 2015, so they've amended the law again because they had two wholesale insolvencies, and it has to be put in a trust account as of October. So we don't know what it will look like. The only way they can get around it is if the payer issues a bond in favour of the payee, saying that if we use the retentions cash for our own purposes and we go bust, you'll still get paid your retentions anyway, which is the fairer system because then it's protected both ways. Sorry, long answer.
No, thank you, Rob. And it looks like from what you say, there are other major jurisdictions around the world that are grappling with this. So I think you could easily do a webinar just on retention models. So keep that up our sleeve for another day. I've got another question for you, Rob, yep. Which comes from Damien James, whom you probably know from UK adjudication. I don't know if the speaker is open for the audience, Tiffany, because it's quite a long one. I was going to ask Damien just to speak up, but if it's not, I'll read it out.
I can certainly allow Damien to speak. Let me just find him here.
There he is.
Damien, if you'd like to pose your question.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie, for bringing me on the mic. Rob, my question was, and it's more of a practical question in terms of where the UK adjudication market goes and how it improves. And it's not an uncommon thing, and it's not an attack on lawyers. But obviously, when I act as a party rep in adjudications, and even when lawyers act in as party reps in adjudications, the barrage of natural justice challenges, jurisdictional challenges, issues with the prayers and the referrals, etc., often detracts from the focus of a technical and commercial aspect of an adjudication and the commercial strategy of why adjudications are often used. I mean, from my point of view, when I sit as an adjudicator, I take a very strong approach with that. You know, I'll listen to it, but I tend to sort of go on the basis that ultimately, if there is a challenge to be raised, that challenge is still permissible to the lawyers in the event that something went wrong. And we saw that 95% adjudications are mostly enforced in the UK. I think the question that I'm trying to get to, from a client's point of view, I see there's an excessive amount of money spent raising these challenges consistently through the process, through the response, through the Surrey joinder, etc., etc., etc. And it's an off-the-wall question. It's abstract. I mean, do you think that the process, based on the statutory requirements in the UK, can be refined somewhat so that the lawyers raise their challenges in their jurisdictions, and they're entitled to do so, and they're entitled to be instructed, etc. But they raise it once in the right environment, and it's set down and it stays there, rather than the consistent regurgitation that we see from the lawyers, which fundamentally, in my opinion, tends to detract from the commercial issues. Do you think that's something that would develop in time, or do you think it's something
Yeah.
which is against the natural, natural justice of law?
I think the answer is yes. Whether lawyers will do it voluntarily is a different question. I think if you look at the success of the UK system, it's speed. There are others here who pointed out the downfalls to speed is rough and ready justice. The potential for getting the wrong decision in law from a lawyer's perspective, but actually might be the right decision from the project's perspective or commercially. So yes, I think you could set a time frame within that 28-day process or extended process, whereby raise it now, forever hold your peace, and you move on rather than keep challenging and challenging and challenging. It is. We seem to forget that this broadest picture is the system's there to quickly and easily deal with the disputes so the parties can get back to what they do, constructing. And I think that's what we forget. And fundamentally, the other point is the supply base forward funds the build process here. Certainly. So on average for everybody else, apart from Damien, here, whether it's milestones or stage payments or anything else, it is always the supplier supplies for a month at a time, roughly, and then asks for payment. And in Carilion's case, I know they're dead and buried for a couple of years now, it was 120 days before you got paid, if you got paid what you thought you were owed. So you're paying for labour materials and then hoping you get paid what you think you're owed at the end of it in forward funding. That's why the whole system's so fragile. So the adjudication, in terms of a time-limited process, is there to solve that issue and keep it on the rails.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I think you could cut them off, these challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with it very much. I mean, it's a commercial process, a strategy process to resolve and keep the parties moving forward together to keep the money flowing in the whole contract. And ultimately, there's arbitration and litigation in the shadow of adjudication all the time. I just see it more and more with the lawyer challenges, and it's not an attack on lawyers. Don't take it that way. They do they do what their clients tell them to do. But I often see that the whole process of regurgitating jurisdictional challenges, natural justice challenges throughout the process can only be costing fees, and that often that money in terms of fees would have been better resolving the dispute. And I think not rough justice. It isn't rough justice. Adjudicators are capable of doing that. I think, but I think there should be, like you say. I mean, we might get there with it. We might sort of limit it and say, "You've made your challenge now. Thanks very much. We don't need to hear it another 4 or 5 times."
Whenever you develop a system, it has to mature, and it will show up bugs. So you develop 2.0. And I think that's where the UK is. Developing 2.0 is refining it. So looking around on the website whilst some of the other guys were talking and listening to it, quickly established some of our A and Bs, and Damien, correct me if I'm wrong, have exams to pass before you can qualify as an adjudicator. So the quality of adjudication is quite high here.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it isn't anywhere else, but that's a result of maturity to make sure decisions and rule systems are followed quickly, expeditiously under the timetabled system.
Okay, thanks, Rob, and thanks to the 2 Johns as well. Thank you. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thanks, Damien, for a great question. Well, we've managed to massively overrun. So I think that's a good sign, because we've still got a lot of people on the webinar, and so I just want to bring it to an end now and say thank you so much to all 3 speakers. I thought you did a fantastic job. I really enjoyed hearing about what's happening in your part of the world, and thank you to the audience who provided some really great questions today. I feel like we need a part 2. There's just too much to talk about. But maybe we'll let the impact of the war in Ukraine play out a little bit more, and we'll schedule part 2 for some time next year. So thanks very much again to everybody, and look forward to reconvening at some point.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank
day.
you.
Hi.